Teri Wiley, and I'm the Managing Director of Pathway to Cures, which is the venture philanthropy fund for the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation. It's a very important aspect. We have been fortunate in the bleeding disorders community to see some profoundly important gene therapies come forward that are changing the lives of these individuals and their families. But these therapies are not accessible to everyone, and there's room for improvement. So we really are looking for next generation disruptive technology. We're looking at platforms that may or may not be used now for bleeding disorders, but could be. And we're open to looking at diagnostics and medical devices because you can't treat a rare disease unless you know that you have it. So diagnosis is important. And it's a big gap, it's a big unmet need in that a lot of people with bleeding disorders, especially women, go for years without a diagnosis with the wrong diagnosis. So disruption is very important. We have a process for looking first and foremost at the science and the clinical aspects, taking into consideration the individuals. We call them lived experience experts, the patients that have this, but we also include families of people with bleeding disorders and considering this. So we are thinking about that at a science and clinical phase. And then we go to an investment phase where we take a very traditional approach in creating an investment memo so that it's a entity that can attract the resources it needs to go all the way to the clinic and through the clinic. But very importantly, one of the reoccurring themes we're seeing as we've looked at 200 opportunities so far, and we're a new fund just starting in early 2023, is that we're often seeing companies that are putting together preclinical and clinical programs that will get them an FDA clearance, but will not get them to the point where they're reaching the patients that need the therapy. And in their terms, they're not getting market penetration. So that doesn't do anybody any good, doesn't do them any good, doesn't provide the incentives for them to continue with the product, and it doesn't do the community any good because they're not getting the products they need. So one of the things that's very important to us is having that lived experience experts opinion at the preclinical stage all the way through. And one of the things the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation does is they do focus groups with lived experience experts on various bleeding disorders for pharmaceutical companies and early stage biotech companies. This is really, really important. We do take into consideration the whole ecosystem. For us, we're especially focused on investment syndications. So we can provide a certain amount of funding and expertise into these companies, but in order for them to be successful, they're going to have large investment syndicates, and syndicates that represent smart money, smart management. So that kind of collaboration is especially important. How do we invest in a way that attracts money alongside us and money to follow us? So that's very important. In the regulatory area, one example is that we are just starting in October. Our first one of these is a research roundtable with the FDA and with pharma and with scientists and with investors to look at this very issue of when you are developing a preclinical and clinical program in the bleeding disorder space, especially for women, what are the nuances and what do you need to know? So we're always looking for ways to bring those entities that are critical to success together in a way that allows them to share information and compress the timeline to getting these therapies and cures to people who need them. Management is absolutely critical. The other thing that we look at as well is inclusive leadership and diverse teams. There's a growing body of evidence that they perform better. I did my MBA in the olden days. In the 80s, they drilled that into you. Inclusive leadership and diverse teams perform better. This is important to business, and this is important to how we look at management teams as well. Actually, whether we're investing or not, if somebody's got a solution that meets an unmet need in our community, we want them to be successful. So as a small fund, we're seeing a lot of things that we would invest in if we had additional resources. And so one of the things that we've said is, what do we have that we can put to work to help those companies be successful as well, even if we're not investing? We have access to KOLs, we have access to lived experience experts. We can introduce them to other investors, whether we're investing or not. So, what's important to us is that there are solutions, and we'd love to be part of those solutions one way or the other. We'd love to be as investors because that helps us, deliver on our evergreen fund model. But at the end of the day, what's important is that the therapies and cures are there. Yeah. Well, we do look at governance. So as we're doing our investment case, we look at strong governance and relevant governance. And depending on the level of which we're investing, we might have a board seat, but usually we end up as an observer on the board because we tend to be smaller investors in these rounds. And we stay in touch with them and continue to help. At the end of the day, we're going to have to rely on strong governance and management, and that we've invested behind. We do also put in place a side letter along with our investment that just speaks to the fact in a very practical way, a way that's not onerous to the other investors or to the company, that the money we're putting in is going to be put towards the bleeding disorder indication. Yeah, it's an exciting thing to be involved in because it allows you to take best practice in business and investing alongside of best practice in not-for-profits. And I'm hoping that we'll see things like we heard about this morning at the conference, where some of these funds have been around a little longer, can point to where they've made a difference, to the fact that there are therapies and cures available to patients and families that weren't there before, and that they are proving out their evergreen model in that if these are successful for investors, that their investment provides resources back to their foundation and not-for-profit to continue with education and support and advocacy. And it's really important that we have the resources to support advocacy in our government for rare disease and for the development of important therapies. That's really important. And again, it's one of the criteria that we look at as we're evaluating companies is how are you putting together your experimental design? What are you taking into consideration? Do you need help from us in doing that? It's very important. And there are bleeding disorders that are in particular underdiagnosed in women. It can manifest itself as heavy menstrual periods, and as they approach their doctors, the doctor may say, oh, this is normal, you just have heavy periods, and then it turns out to be very serious. If they are going to have a family, you can end up with postpartum bleeding that's very serious. So it's really important, and it's hard to get a good diagnosis with some of these platelet disorders or factor disorders or von Willebrand disease. So this is an area where we have a lot of attention from our communications and advocacy and education groups too, to create awareness about heavy menstrual bleeding with women and how they can go about being seen appropriately by hematologists and to receive the diagnosis that's so important. And we have attention to that in our investing program, but also in our education program and advocacy program at the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation as well. So we're working arm in arm with our parent organization, and what they're doing and what they're learning informs how we invest.